good. Let me ask a question. How many of you have been to Hawaii on an airplane? How long did it take? 5 hours. Okay. Roz did it 475 times slower. Okay, so she got a really good look going to Hawaii. She's National Geographic Adventure of the Year in 2010. She holds 4 world records in rowing going across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. And tonight she's here to share some of her adventures for all of us. And with that, I'm very proud to introduce, and let's have a round of applause for Miss Roz Savage. Thank you, Roz. Take over.
Thank you. Oh, this mic was set up for tall people, maybe tall rowers. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and I'd like to say a huge thank you especially to Tom and Rita and the rest of the staff at the ExplorOcean Newport Beach Maritime Museum for...
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you very much. This is what I pay you for. Oh. Right, I'm going to ask you to put up hands as well. Would you please put your hand in the air if you would be comfortable spending 5 minutes on your own? 5 minutes, not very long at all. I think we can all do that. Okay, keep your hands in the air. Now keep your hands up. No, on dry land. You're allowed to be comfortable for the purposes of this exercise. Hands up if you would be comfortable spending 5 hours on your own. Like a half day, go out for a ramble somewhere, bit of time off from the kids, or how about 5 days? A slightly longer retreat. Ooh, we're losing a few now. How about 5 weeks? Oh, we still got some staunch souls with their hands up. How about 5 months? Good for you guys. You could be my crewmates the next time I do the Indian Ocean. Last year, I spent exactly 5 months alone at sea crossing the Indian from Western Australia to Mauritius. Now, throw into that equation, not only is it 5 months alone, it's 5 months without internet, without being able to go to the shops, without TV, without a hot shower, without a glass of wine, while contending with big waves and constantly breaking equipment and having to row for 12 hours a day. I guess it might not be most people's idea of fun. And to be honest, it's not mine either. But I hope that I can explain a bit to you about why this ever seemed to be a good idea, and why I've done it not 1 but 3 times. But just to take you back a little bit to an early stage. As a baby, I showed no signs of incipient madness or didn't come out of the womb holding an oar. Here I am with my beautiful mother back in 1968 at the age of 2 weeks. As I grew up, I seemed to get rather out of focus. And this is me growing up in Cheshire, in the north of England. A little bit older, and maybe I'm starting to show a little bit more affinity with water. That's me looking very glamorous and shapely in the middle, and my younger sister over on the right, she's about 17 months younger than I am. Between the two of us, we have failed to produce a single offspring, to my mother's great chagrin. But my cousin Juliet over on the left has produced 7, so she's kind of made up for our lack. When I went to university, this was the first time that I took up rowing, or in fact, it was the first time I took up any sport at all. I'd hated physical education at school, just wasn't into it. I was small for my age, still am, and was always the last person picked for teams. But when I got to Oxford, I thought, well, I probably really ought to start doing a bit more exercise, mostly so that I could eat more without getting fat. So I took up rowing with all the zeal of the convert and actually rowed for Oxford University a couple of times in our annual races against Cambridge. But then I grew up, I graduated, and like most people of my generation, went to work in the City of London. I was a management consultant, getting up early every morning, getting on the commuter train, trundling into the city to go and work in an office cubicle for between 10 and 12 hours a day. I hadn't really known what I wanted to do when I graduated, and I reckoned management consultancy would be a pretty good stopgap until I figured out what I really wanted to do when I grew up. Unfortunately, 11 years later, I still had not figured out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I think I'd known pretty much from day one that this wasn't really what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, but I just didn't have any better ideas. And it kind of reached a crisis point where I just felt like there was this mismatch between the person that I was on the inside and this life that I was living on the outside. On the outside, I looked like the professional in my little pinstripe skirt suit and my smart little shoes going to work in the office each day. But on the inside, there was an adventurer fighting to get out. For many years, I'd been an armchair adventurer, reading books about people who were trekking to poles or climbing mountains or sailing alone around the world. But they all seemed to have a spirit and a courage and usually a beard that I just didn't have. Almost all of them seemed to be guys. And when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I just didn't see an adventurer looking back at me. But then one day I met somebody who changed my mind. I went to listen to a talk at the Adventure Show in London, and there was a couple there, a married couple, and they had set out to row across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, he looked like your archetypal adventurer, about 6'5", about 220 pounds, big, strong, strapping guy. She was about my size. And they said that before they set out across the ocean, everybody sort of assumed that he'd be doing all the hard work and she'd be sort of sitting on the bow, looking pretty and glamorous, wearing a bikini. Well, what actually happened was that when they set out from the Canaries, he just couldn't cope with it. He was terrified, and he ended up curled up in the fetal position inside the cabin, just completely quaking like a jelly, incapacitated by fear. He had to be lifted off the boat. Meanwhile, she was actually having quite a good time, and she carried on and completed the crossing on her own. So, good for Deborah, yeah. So I thought, wow, well, if she could do it, maybe I can. And at that same very formative stage in my life, I came up with my life purpose, I would say. I had really been so focused on my materialistic life, I'd never even thought about the environment, about the impact I was having on the earth. But at this very formative stage in my life, I was reading a book about the Hopi tribe and their belief that we have to take good care of the earth if we want it to take good care of us. Stands to reason. We've only got one planet, and what goes around comes around. And when I read that, I just thought, my word, why did I never think of this before? It's actually so obvious. And I felt appalled that I'd never thought about this before. I was supposedly well-educated, intelligent, well-read, but it had just never even occurred to me. And when I looked around, I saw lots of other people who didn't seem to be thinking about it too much. And I thought, what can I do that will help to get this message out there? And so I chose ocean rowing as my platform for this message. So I signed up to do the Atlantic rowing race. Somehow did two there. This is my boat as I first saw her way back in 2004. Just a shell of a boat. She'd actually been built for somebody else who was going to row her across the Pacific, but then thought better of it. Maybe I should have learned something from that. After 14 months of full-on hard work, during which I lived and breathed and slept ocean rowing, my boat had been transformed into a proper ocean-going rowboat with solar panels, batteries, oars, pretty useful to have on a rowboat, a proper rowing position, and all the comms and safety equipment that I would need to see me across the Atlantic. I'd signed up to do the Atlantic rowing race, which was going to set out from the Canary Islands, just off the coast of Africa, and cross 3,000 miles of ocean to Antigua in the Caribbean. Unfortunately, I had picked a really, really bad year to do the Atlantic. Back in 2005, year of Hurricane Katrina, and still is the worst year since records began 200 years ago for weather in the North Atlantic. Probably just as well I didn't know that when I set out. In fact, it rapidly became apparent there was a lot I didn't know when I set out. And if I had known it, I probably would have stayed safely in the Canaries, which are really rather nice after all. I'd thought I was well prepared. I'd read all the books, I'd spoken to all the ocean rowers, I'd looked at all the websites. I really thought that I was as well prepared as a novice could be for this big project I'd undertaken. But the reality was a bit of a slap in the face with a wet fish. Very early on, things started to break. By the time I wasn't even halfway across, I just reached that first little blue marker. 4 of my oars had broken. I wish I could say it's because I'm so strong that I broke them with my own brute strength, but in fact it was those big waves that if they caught me sideways would push the boat sideways over the top of the oar, and it would end up kind of wrapped around the side deck of the boat. So what do you do when you're in the middle of an ocean with 4 broken oars? Well, it's a bit like scrap heap challenge. You kind of look around and see what you've got to hand, and you make do and mend. So luckily I had a boat hook, which is like about 4 foot long pole, and my boat maker had kept trying to throw it away. Said, it's for hooking mooring buoys. What are you going to need with that in the middle of the ocean? But I just had a feeling it might come in useful for something, and it surely did. I was able to split it into 2 pieces and get out my trusty duct tape and lash the boat hook to the oars. And it made them a bit off balance, which certainly didn't help the condition of my shoulders. I was suffering from tendinitis from very early on in the row. But at least I was able to carry on rowing. The oars were not the only casualties. Within the first month, my little camping stove broke. This was what I used to boil up water to rehydrate my freeze-dried meals. You know, the meals in a bag that you might take hiking with you. So from then on, I had to eat all my meals cold. And I hope for your sake that you've never tried a cold freeze-dried meal. It's just not very yummy. My stereo broke. Major disaster. So after the first few weeks, I really had nothing to entertain me apart from my own thoughts and my own singing. Desperate times indeed. I would actually count a lot of oar strokes. I would take about 1,000 oar strokes in an hour. So I would count up to 500, and then just for variety, I would count back down from 500. And I got quite fond of certain numbers, like 111 and 222 and 333. It was, I suppose, like the ultimate Vipassana retreat, where you just have to try and find something, anything, to keep you going through the day. For me, it was a massive exercise in exploring my own motivation. There were so many times when I just really, really wanted to give up. It was so hard. It pushed me beyond anything that I would have said were my limits. Fortunately, it's extremely difficult to quit because once you set out from the Canaries, the trade winds very soon kick in and start pushing you towards the Caribbean. And probably any time from the first few hours onwards, if I'd have thought, you know, actually, this wasn't such a good idea, I think I'll just turn around and row back again, I actually physically wouldn't have been able to do it. So I really just had to hang on in there and figure out how to keep body and soul and sanity together until I reached the other side. But just to give you one little insight into my state of mind, here's a little clip of video. I just ended up on the deck on all fours, just yelling, just screaming with frustration and anger, and I'm just at my wit's end. Maybe not the most flattering still image to finish that little clip on, but that pretty much sums up how I felt. And around that time, I remember having a phone conversation on the satellite phone with my poor, long-suffering mother who, as you can probably guess, had been less than enchanted with the idea of her elder daughter rowing solo across an ocean. And I'm talking with Mum, and it's one of only 2 times on the ocean that I actually broke down and cried. I was just feeling so sorry for myself. And my mum, bless her, resisted the urge to say, well, Rosalind, I could have told you it was a bad idea. Instead, she just said, Rosalind, would you like to quit? Would you like to give up? And about 90% of me was going, yes, I want to give up. I hate it out here. But almost immediately, I realised that I'd put so much into this. And not only that, but so many people had actually shown faith in me. Lots of people had chipped in, a few pounds here and a contribution of time there and lent me stuff for the boat. All these people had actually believed that I could do this. Or even if they didn't actually believe I could do it, they just wanted to feel that they'd done what they could to help this obvious lunatic in her mission. And I realised I would actually just never forgive myself if I quit at that point. I'd come this far. Yes, I could have got on the phone and asked for the race support yacht to come and pick me up, as they'd had to do with Andrew, the guy who ended up curled up in the cabin, incapacitated. But I was just too proud to give up. And not only that, I had this mission. I had this environmental mission that was so much bigger than just one miserable little woman in a rowboat trying to get to the other side of the ocean. It was, if for nothing else, I had to keep going for that reason. So I said, no, Mum, yes, I do want to give up, but no, I'm not going to. And I'm really grateful to her for asking me that question, because it actually made me realise that I had a choice, that I could ask to get lifted off the boat. She'd sort of opened that door for me, but I'd managed to find the strength to say, no, I choose to carry on. And that in itself made me feel so much better. And I'm really glad that we had that conversation then, because about 3 days later, my satellite phone broke. And I lost my chance of communication. So from that point on, even if I'd wanted to get lifted off the boat, I couldn't have done. And it's funny, you might think that the phone breaking would be the worst thing that could possibly happen, like my one lifeline to shore. But in fact, it really transformed how I felt about my mission. I suppose I'd gone out there, amongst many other goals, I'd wanted to find out what I was capable of when I had nobody to rely on. For so much of my life, I depended on parents, teachers, boyfriends, friends, husband, and I'd really wanted to find out, what can I do when it's just down to me? And this really was now the ultimate test. I had no shoulder to cry on, no means of access to help. It really was just me and my little boat and the ocean. Sunday the 19th of February, my second day without any contact with the outside world. And I can't tell you, I'm loving it. I've never known peace like it. I'm starting to feel that I'm regaining my energy. I've just been rowing along this afternoon, feeling so serene and calm. It's just been one of those really magic moments. If I could bottle that feeling, I'd make millions. It's better than any drug. Just the feeling of total self-sufficiency, self-reliance. Just me and my little boat in the middle of the ocean. Just happy and content. I've never known peace like it. It's an absolute, total peace. Yeah, there's no other word for it. It's made it all worthwhile, all the agony, all the suffering, all the pain, all the self-doubt. It's been worth it just for that feeling that I've experienced this afternoon. That's what hair looks like when it hasn't been washed for 3 months. And a few weeks later, I finally, after 103 days alone at sea, the last 24 of which without communications, I arrived in English Harbour in Antigua. fantastic place to arrive, although by that stage I really would have been happy to see any dry land at all. It was just absolutely the best feeling. I don't think I stopped grinning for a week. It was like a combination of finishing a marathon and winning an Oscar and getting out of jail all rolled into one. Just absolute euphoria. And the people who turned out to greet me, and I just remember feeling this overwhelming love for them all. They were the most beautiful, wonderful people I'd ever seen in my whole life. And my dear, long-suffering mum was there to greet me in. And some kind soul also handed me a nice cold beer. I can't tell you how well that went down. So I felt like I'd learned a lot about how to row an ocean, mostly by doing it the wrong way. And I thought, well, let's try and do it the right way. And so I announced my intention to row across the Pacific. Now, I thought the Atlantic was big, but the Pacific is really, really big. It covers almost half of the planet. It was going to be 8,000 miles rather than the mere 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. So I decided to break up the journey, and really, who in their right mind would row straight past Hawaii without dropping in? So I was going to break the journey in Hawaii and then in the South Pacific. So I got my little boat, shipped from the Caribbean over to Florida, where she spent a month in the Museum of Science and Industry in Tampa. And then I drove her across to the other side of the country behind my little yellow pickup truck. This is Bonneville Flats in Utah. That was quite a fun road trip. It's certainly a great conversation starter, having a 23-foot rowboat behind your truck. In 2007, I finally set out. I'd really wanted to leave from the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, one of my favourite cities. But I waited and waited for a break in the onshore winds. The prevailing winds there are blowing out of the west and kind of howl through the headlands under the Golden Gate Bridge. And I just wasn't getting a break in the weather. So eventually my weatherman said, you can leave from San Francisco or you can leave this year, but you probably can't do both. So go north. So I headed up to Crescent City, a little place up near the border with Oregon that got flattened by a tsunami back in the 70s. Again, a reminder of the awesome power of the ocean. Set out into beautiful, calm conditions. It was a wonderful first day. These sea lions kept coming over to check me out. They would turn up in a little posse, and they would all kind of be rolling around each other in the water, just showing off and popping their heads up to check me out. It was great. Couldn't have asked for a better start. Unfortunately, it was not to last. About 10 days later, the winds picked up. You can see from my jagged course that isn't me going, oh, you know what, don't fancy this after all. That's actually me just getting blown back towards the shore. Then I managed to start making some progress again, but the winds were rising, the waves were up to about 20 feet, and my boat started to capsize. And it went over 3 times in 24 hours. Now, it does self-right, but during those capsizes, some of my equipment got damaged. I got knocked around a bit. I was inside the cabin when it happened, but my restraining straps across the bunk that are supposed to stop me getting flung around in the cabin, they actually ripped out from the cabin floor. So I banged my head. But it wasn't too bad. I mean, it was not ideal, definitely, but my weatherman was saying, if you can just hang on in there, the weather will calm down in about another 24 hours. So I was really just kind of hanging tough out there, but I had maybe carelessly blogged about this. I'd put messages on my website saying, you know, it's not great out here, things are okay, but I have suffered this damage. And unfortunately, somebody who maybe cared just a little bit too much decided to be a hero and to call up the US Coast Guard. And the first that I knew of this was when a little aeroplane turned up overhead. And for a while, I tried to ignore them, thinking, oh, they must be here for somebody else, because I didn't call them. But obviously there wasn't really anybody else around, and eventually I realised I was going to have to make radio contact with them and find out what was going on. So they expressed concern about my situation out there, and don't get me wrong, I don't sound like I resented them turning up. The Coast Guard are fantastic guys. They are out there day after day putting their lives on the line for people who need their help. But I just felt that I didn't qualify. I didn't feel that I did need their help. I wanted to carry on. But over the course of the next 6 hours, I kind of veered between should I, shouldn't I? The boat has got a bit dinged up. Maybe I could still go back to shore, get it fixed while there's still the opportunity. And it got to 6 p.m. and they said, we need a decision from you. You're drifting away from the coast. By tomorrow, you'll be outside of the range of our helicopters. So it really is now or never. It's going to get dark. You have to make a decision right now. Well, it was a pretty big decision. I'd spent 1.5 years getting ready for this. Didn't want to give up on my dream. So I said, give me 5 minutes. I just want to call my weatherman. I just want to get verification on what the weather's going to do over the next 24 hours. So I call up my weatherman on the satellite phone, and I get voicemail. So it had to be my decision. The buck stopped with me. And when it came to the crunch, I thought, well, better to be a live donkey than a dead lion, as the saying goes. Better to err on the side of caution. And so I called them back and I said, okay, bring me in. So I'll show you a little clip of what happened next. They sent out the helicopter to do an airlift. I think the worst moment for me on this was the bit where the helicopter pilot says, now, when we let the swimmer down, we're going to ask you to jump in the water. So I'm there on suddenly my boat at that point looked like my safe haven. I'm going, I don't really want to jump into 20-foot waves out there. But I didn't really have much choice by that stage. And here's what happened next.
This is Coast Guard helicopter overhead.
I'll get too close, won't go here. Roger.
Hi, this is Rose.
Okay, Ross, we're the helicopter that you're looking at right now. We're going to go ahead and lower our rescue swimmer in about 2 minutes. He's going to be almost halfway down, and he's going to give us a signal, and I'm going to tell you on the radio to go ahead and jump in the water. Do you understand that?
Yes, I understand.
And home position, taking the left, taking the load. Taking the load, somebody's coming up, somebody's pouring water. Clear to the back and left. Roger. Somebody's coming up. Speaks command, Roger. Somebody's coming up. Somebody's halfway up. Someone's coming up. Someone's still on cabin. Someone's coming up. Somebody Roger has outside cabin door. Booming in. Booming in. Booming in.
I actually sounded quite calm there, didn't I? When he says, you're going to jump in the water, do you understand? And I go, I understand. On the inside, I was going, holy, you want me to do what? So here I am, looking cheerful on the outside, but on the inside, just feeling completely mortified, really. Just humiliated, disappointed, wondering if I made the right decision or not. Just a very profound feeling of I'm in the wrong place. I'm on dry land. I was supposed to be out there with my little boat, who incidentally is still drifting around 100 miles offshore. So great guys. I'm still in touch with the pilot on the right, actually. I've just been working on the book that tells the story of my Pacific crossing, so I was doing my fact-checking with him and actually only found out subsequently that we nearly didn't make it back to dry land at all because they were at the absolute outer limit of their range, and we were running on fumes when we got back to dry land. And we were actually just about to land in Humboldt when it got socked in with fog, and we actually had to divert to another base, by which time we were running on beyond fumes. So that could have been a really bad day in the office for all of us. like I say, still had to salvage my boat, so I chartered a research vessel, about 130 foot long, this ship, and with a small band of friends, we set out from San Francisco to go and retrieve my boat. Unfortunately, it had a transponder on it that was beaming back my position via satellite, so we were able to track it as it drifted south and intercept it. My plan at that point had been to get the boat all fixed up and immediately restart the row. I just completely wanted to erase and rewind the events of the previous few days, and I felt the best way of doing that was just to get straight on with it. But it was already really late in the season, and also there was a good reason that my boat had been capsizing, and that reason had to be addressed. So again, another really tough decision, but had to abandon my attempt for that year, bring the boat back. We put her into the boatyard, installed 200 pounds of lead down in the bottom of the hull, and took some of the weighty equipment off the top of the boat, and she has been much more seaworthy ever since. 9 months later, I was finally able to set out again, and this time the dream came true. I was able to leave from under San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge. This is where we did all the work on the boat down in San Francisco as well. And at midnight on the 24th of May, 2008, I set out once again across the Pacific.
Bravo, Raz. Go for it. Woo! See you in Hawaii. There she goes.
So the first few oar strokes of the 3 million that it would eventually take me to cross the Pacific, I didn't count every stroke, I admit, but given my average stroke rate and how long it would take me, it was around about 3 million. Difficult to describe how that feels. I think I learned on the Atlantic that you really just have to take it one oar stroke at a time. Early on in the Atlantic crossing, I'd become quite overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge, looking at 3,000 miles and thinking, well, if I'm only doing 2 miles an hour, then it's going to take me, oh my word, a very, very long time. I've really learned since then that just to focus on the immediate day ahead, to have a very clear idea in my mind of where I'm trying to get to and how wonderful it's going to be to make landfall on the far side. And then really just to focus on what do I have to do today to get myself a little bit closer to that goal. As per usual, things did not go particularly smoothly. Within the first few hundred miles, I'd encountered some really quite rough conditions. You can see I'm on quite a wiggly course here. And the locker where my water maker lives had got swamped. Now, the water maker is the most important piece of equipment on my boat. It sucks in salt water and turns it into drinking water through a process of reverse osmosis. And like most bits of electrical equipment, it doesn't take too kindly to being submerged in seawater. So it gradually rusted and sputtered to a halt. And there's not much you can do with it at that stage. I've since learned always to take a spare pump with me for it. But you learn these things the hard way. As they say, experience is that thing that you get just after you needed it. So I did have quite a bit of spare water on board, enough to last me about 6 weeks, but I still reckoned that I was going to run out a little bit before I reached Hawaii, like a couple of weeks before. So this was definitely a cause for concern. Luckily, fate stepped in. My mission on this part of my row was to draw attention to the North Pacific Garbage Patch, which you may have heard of. It's this area of plastic rubbish floating around in the North Pacific, allegedly covering an area about twice the size of Texas, with an estimated 3.5 million tons of rubbish, mostly plastic, out there. So I'd already been talking about that, and some people have said, oh, you should really have a chat with these two guys from Long Beach. They're also going to be out there on the ocean at the same time as you, again, to raise awareness of plastic pollution in the oceans. Now, I'd had a chat with those guys and found out a little bit more about their project. They were building a boat called the Junk Raft because it was quite literally made out of junk. They'd got 15,000 empty water bottles and lashed them together into 2 pontoons with cargo netting. Then they'd put a grid of yacht masts to create a deck. The fuselage of a Cessna airplane was their cabin, and then they'd stuck a sail on it and called it a boat. And they had set out from Long Beach just a little while after I'd set out from San Francisco. They hadn't got very far before the lids on those water bottles started to come undone. And they'd had to pull in at Catalina Island to do all the lids up again before they could carry on. Their voyage, unsurprisingly, was really taking rather a long time. Hey, you go to sea on junk, and what do you expect? They were only just starting to catch up with me. And I found out about this when people started posting comments on my blog saying, hey, the junk craft is catching up with you. And they were also putting comments on their blog saying, hey, you're catching up with Roz the rower. So our shore teams got in touch and passed along respective satellite phone numbers. And over the course of a couple of weeks, we arranged a rendezvous in mid-ocean. They were running out of food, I was running out of water. We were both out there with the same mission. It just seemed like we couldn't have made this up if we'd tried. So where that little blue marker is where we met up for one of the world's more unusual dinner parties. They had promised me a fresh fish supper. I was really looking forward to this. I don't do any fishing when I'm at sea. I confess I'm a bit of a wimp. I'm just a bit squeamish about having to bang the fish on the head and then all that gutting, it's all a bit messy on your deck. But if there were a couple of guys willing to do all the hard work for me, then I was more than happy to accept their hospitality. So I'd just like to show you a little video that Marcus made of our encounter on the ocean. He has a slightly idiosyncratic directorial style, so just go with it. But it's a fun little video.
Guess who we met in the middle of the ocean? Roz Savage in her little rowboat. Oh,
Hey, that's a cool rowboat.
It's a really cool rowboat that Roz Savage is rowing across the Pacific Ocean to raise awareness about the plastic marine debris issue.
If I carry on rowing, they're never going to catch up with me.
We hauled in our surface trawl to show Roz what the marine debris issue looks like in the North Pacific Gyre.
Back to science. Back to science. So, Dr. Erickson.
You can see all the junk. Meanwhile, Joel hauled in the mahi-mahi that we had promised her over the radio. We had a great meal together, traded food and water, took a few photographs. As the sun set, we parted ways. Thank you, Roz. We'll see you in Hawaii.
And if you're interested in finding out more about their work, then this is their website, the5gyres.org, because there are, in fact, 4 other oceanic confluences of plastic pollution, as well as that one in the North Pacific. In a typical day's sample, they were finding about 6 times as much plastic as plankton. Obviously, plankton is the good stuff, the basis of the ocean food chain, and the plastic, very much not so good. Pretty much a toxic substance out there that is actually leaking out BPAs and other chemicals into the seawater. In a recent study, scientists found BPA in 100% of ocean water samples that they tested. I did indeed meet up with Joel and Marcus again a few weeks later in Hawaii. There we go. Again, marvellous to reach dry land. My voyage had taken me 99 days. Theirs had taken them 88 days. So oars were almost as good as a sail. I rowed in past Diamond Head, which is the landmark signifying the end of the Transpac sailing race. I then paddled on into the Waikiki Yacht Club, where I had quite an amusing encounter with a very confused member of the US Coast Guard Auxiliary, who didn't really quite grasp the concept of ocean rowing.
Hi, auxiliary. Hi. What is it powered on?
Oars.
Oars.
Yes.
Have you been paddling at all? All the time. All the time. It doesn't have a sail, it doesn't have an engine, it's a rowboat.
You could sort of see her thinking, you know there's an airport just over there, don't you? The following year, I set out on stage 2 of the Pacific, leaving from the Waikiki Yacht Club and heading across the equator and across the international dateline down into the South Pacific. There is a lot of blue on this map. The Pacific, I think we don't always appreciate quite how big it is because most of the maps of the world that we look at kind of chop it in half and stick it off to the edges. But when you actually look on Google Earth to see how it looks from that side of the planet, it is just vast. I think I will remember this stage of the row mostly for the amazing wildlife encounters that I had. Some booby birds sitting on my boat. Turtles are my real favourites. Whales and dolphins. This was a whale shark, vegetarian shark. You can see they would come really close to the boat. Not quite on National Geographic cinematography standards, but the best you can do from a tippy little rowboat. I'd just like to say a little bit more about a couple of the wildlife encounters. The whale shark, what a beautiful creature. This one followed in my sea anchor one day. My sea anchor is a big red and yellow parachute on a long rope attached to the boat that I put out to stop me being blown too far backwards if the wind's against me. And this particular Sunday morning, I'm pulling in the sea anchor because the wind has changed in my favour. And the whale shark must have been fascinated by this big red and yellow object and followed it all the way into my boat. And so when I looked down into the water, I saw this incredibly beautiful creature. It's got these lovely markings. I have to say its face, really only its mother could love it. It's got this huge mouth, which it uses to just scoop up plankton. It spent about 20 minutes just swimming around my boat. It was a tiddler, as whale sharks go. It was only 8 feet long. There was a whale shark picked up in, I think, Pakistan a few weeks ago that was 40 feet long. So they can be huge. That would have been twice the size of my boat. Not all the visitors were quite so welcome or so pleasant. The booby birds are without a doubt the smelliest, stupidest creatures that I have ever encountered. Although maybe actually they're not that stupid, because when they saw this little rowboat making its way across the ocean, they thought, well, hey, why should we bother flying when we can just hitch a ride on this convenient boat? And so there are actually usually 2 or 3 of them perched up here on my bow cabin. As you can see, they made a horrible mess. They proceeded to poop liberally all over my solar panels and then trample it all around just for good measure. And I tried everything to get rid of my hitchhikers. I tried being polite to start off with and shooing them away. And then I tried throwing water over them, and none of this had any effect whatsoever. It escalated to the point where I was actually banging them on the beak. I'm sorry to all naturalists here, with my dustpan and physically scooping them off the bow of the boat. But they seem to have a real short-term memory problem because they would just fly off in a huge circle and come straight back again and sit there squawking at me as if nothing had happened. So in the end, I just gave up, cranked up the volume on my iPod and tried to ignore them. But it was still not pleasant coming out in the morning, just wondering what kind of horrible mess they would have made on the rowing seats during the night. That stage of the row ended up in Kiribati. You could see there were a lot of wiggles along the way. There were some really tricky currents at the equator that wrought havoc with my course. I landed up here. The little Republic of Kiribati, which is the only country in the world to straddle all 4 hemispheres, north and south and east and west. They did actually eventually put a wiggle into the international date line so that the whole country could be in the same day, because they used to have half the country in today and half the country in tomorrow. I don't know quite how that could work anywhere else. You know, in New York, can you imagine if that was spread across 2 days, what taxi drivers would charge you to drive all the way to tomorrow and back? But luckily in Tarawa, in Kiribati, it's a much slower pace of life, so they managed to tolerate that situation for many decades before they changed it. Very interesting place from some points of view. You can see from this picture, it's very low-lying. It's that little green line on the horizon. And so understandably, they are very concerned about the prospect of climate change and rising oceans. And in fact, it's also being found that just average wave heights, even apart from storms, are rising around the world. And I saw the president and his delegation again that winter at the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference. It was the last night of the conference, and they were pretty devastated at the failure of that conference to reach a fair and binding agreement on climate change. But anyway, in the meantime, happier days, rowing in to landfall. This leg had been 104 days, during which time I'd only seen one other vessel. They have this wonderful tradition there where when seafarers arrive, they send down 2 big hunky guys to carry you ashore, which is probably just as well, because my brain gets so used to compensating for the constant movement of the boat that when I step ashore, it feels like dry land is actually tilting. So I was very glad to see them for, just so many reasons. I have to say, fresh coconut water went down extremely well. If you ever need to rehydrate after a 104-day workout, I would highly recommend it. And some traditional dancing as well. A very warm welcome. The following year, 2010, did the 3rd and final stage of the Pacific Row, which would take me the relatively shorter leg from Kiribati to Papua New Guinea. As I was rowing through the Solomon Sea, I had, which is the little final leg there, I had 2 quite contrasting experiences. The first one was, in retrospect, quite funny, although at the time just deeply embarrassing. Ocean rowers, as you might have noticed in the earlier clip of me on the Atlantic, tend not to wear that much. Clothes get salty and sweaty and they chafe, and obviously my laundry facilities are fairly limited, and it's also boiling hot, so it's generally easier just to wear as little as possible. It's not something I would ever do in public. I'm British, we don't do that kind of thing, but in the middle of an ocean where you've got several thousand miles of personal space, it doesn't really matter. Until you get caught out by a helicopter. One day I'm rowing along with my earbuds in, listening to my audiobook, quite happy in my own little world, when I look across and I see a helicopter about 100 yards away from me, hovering about 10 feet above the water, with 2 guys leering out of the window at me. I whip off my sun hat and cover as much of myself as I can, but believe me, suddenly that sun hat was nowhere near big enough. The other experience was rather less amusing. This is a view of a rowboat that you don't really want to get. Normally I keep everything tied on to the boat because I know from past experience that anything that is not tied on, sooner or later a wave will come along and sweep it away. However, on this one occasion, I had my trusty boat hook propping up my sun canopy, and I don't know, momentary lapse, I hadn't attached it to the boat, and it duly fell overboard. Now, I didn't especially need that boat hook. I had another one on board, but I felt like I couldn't do all this campaigning on plastic pollution and then contribute to the problem. So I had to try and retrieve it. So I take off my sun hat, earbuds, rowing gloves, hop in the water, swim over to the boat hook, pick it up, turn around to see where the boat is, only to see that it has been drifting in that direction while I've been swimming in that direction. and it's now looking quite some distance away. I tried to swim back to it, but it's obviously not too easy swimming with a 4-foot pole in your hand. So I realised quite quickly I'm going to have to let go of that and kind of send it off with a prayer that some fisherman will find it and put it to good use. But by that point, I was already quite exhausted. And I can swim a long way, but what I needed now was speed. I needed to be able to catch up with my boat. And this might sound sort of corny, but my mum sort of came to my rescue. As I'm there in the water, trying to catch up with the boat, I remember a conversation I'd had with my mum the previous year. She told me that she'd had this nightmare in which they'd found my boat drifting at sea with nobody on board, and in her nightmare, she knew that I must have drowned. And when she told me about this, I'd said, "Mum, don't worry, I promise you, I will never let that happen. I will not become separated from my boat." So I'm there in the water, and I remember this, and I go, "I can't drown, my mum will kill me." So that somehow just gave me the bit of extra impetus or bit of willpower, courage that I needed, that bit of extra speed to catch up with my boat. And I remember grabbing hold of that black grab line around the boat and never feeling quite so relieved in my entire life. Pulled myself up onto deck with my heart just absolutely pounding, thinking, wow, that was really dumb. I certainly haven't made that mistake again. Yes, that is the closest I have ever come to dying. And hopefully, I was going to say the closest I'll ever come. Obviously, one day I'll come a lot closer, but let's hope that's a long way in the future. Having survived that experience, a couple of weeks later, I made it into Madang in Papua New Guinea. I knew there wasn't going to be anybody that I knew there to meet me. My mum had sort of drawn the line. I mean, flying to Hawaii is one thing, nice vacation, but Madang is a little bit more challenging. So I thought I might just end up sort of rowing up to the jetty and going ashore, and that would be it. But as I'm paddling in at dawn, these canoes start to show up. And as I get closer to land, more and more of them are coming out to greet me in. Seems that the word had gone out on the grapevine that there was an ocean rower arriving in town. And it ended up being really quite an amazing flotilla. And as I turned the corner into the harbour, there were about 5,000 people standing on the banks to greet me in. I felt like a rock star. They were so kind. They'd even made this banner of welcome. And they gave me gifts of local jewellery and betel nuts, the nuts that they chew that stain the teeth red. They dressed up in traditional costume for me. It was just absolutely amazing. Flowers and pretty cool. I feel very lucky to have been to some of these countries. There's no way that I would have gone to Papua New Guinea on vacation, but I feel really fortunate to have spent about 6 weeks of my life there and really got to know the local culture and the local people a little bit. So having done 2 oceans, I thought, well, why not round it off? Why not do the third big world ocean, the Indian? Now, this was going to be the biggest challenge yet. There wasn't really going to be anywhere convenient for me to stop off en route, so this was going to be 4,000 miles non-stop. So I got my boat shipped from Madang over to Australia. There's just in summary, the Pacific. 8,000 miles, 3 million oar strokes, 250 days. Wow, I feel quite tired just saying that. Got my boat shipped to Western Australia, where she changed colour. Same boat, but new paint job. Went for a rather fetching shade of purple. Tried out the local delicacies. It's sort of an acquired taste, and I don't think I acquired it. I set out with 2 jars of Vegemite on my boat, and I arrived on the other side with 1 3/4 jars of Vegemite on my boat. Set out into lovely, calm conditions. There's not that much you can control about the weather once you're out on the ocean, but what you can choose is when you set off. So it was pretty much like a mirror when I left from Fremantle last May. However, as per usual, that was not to last. And